January the 2nd, 1987. Northern Chad doesn't look like a place where the Cold War should matter. No marble halls, no television studios, no red carpets for generals. Just a hard sky and a flat bleached desert that makes every shadow feel like a mistake. But on this morning, the desert is an auditorium. At Fada, a Libyan garrison sits behind berms and trenches, and the kind of confidence you can smell before you hear it. Stale cigarettes, hot diesel, metal warming in the sun. Inside their bunkers are maps printed in Tripoli, manuals translated from Moscow, and a simple belief that has carried empires for a century. If you have the heavier machine, you own the ground. Out on the perimeter, the pride of that belief waits in the glare. T-55 tanks, thick blunt shapes of Soviet logic, steel designed for Europe, built for the Fulda Gap, imagined for a war where the enemy is another tank, politely appearing in front of your gun at a range both sides recognize. 100 millimeters of rifle certainty. A turret like a small building. Armor built to endure a world that might be radioactive. And now, in Chad, it's a symbol. The crews check their sights. They look out through narrow optics that turn the horizon into a tunnel, a periscope slit, a drinking straw. It's comforting in a way. The world is simpler when you can only see a slice of it. In the Libyan command post, men speak of the enemy the way bored adults speak of bad weather. The Chadians are light, disorganized, poor. The kind of army that propaganda can reduce to sandals and rifles and hunger. A militia, not a mechanized force. No real artillery. No air cover worth mentioning. No logistics chain that can sustain anything serious. The math seems obvious. Steel versus flesh. The 20th century versus whatever the desert is supposed to represent. That's why the first warning doesn't arrive as a radio message or an artillery ranging shot. It arrives as dust. A cloud rises to the south, huge, dirty, fast, and it grows with the steady certainty of something moving at speed. The watchtower spotters lift binoculars and expect the usual silhouettes. Slow tracks. Heavy trucks, the exhausting procession of a conventional attack. But the dust is wrong. It doesn't crawl. It doesn't grind forward like armor. It surges. It's closing too quickly. So quickly that for a moment the mind rejects it. The way you reject a dream detail that doesn't fit. Desert warfare is supposed to be heavy and slow. A contest of machines that must be fed and dragged and repaired. You can hear it coming. You can map it. You can schedule it. This dust cloud is not asking permission. A Libyan officer feels it before he understands it. A small prick of uncertainty under the ribs. He grabs a handset. Orders go out. Turrets traverse. And the tanks obey with the sound of a giant waking up. A strained whine of hydraulics. A grinding rotation of mass. Gun barrels swing toward the oncoming haze. Inside one turret, a gunner presses his eye to the rubber cup of the sight. The world becomes a narrow circle. Heat shimmer turns everything into liquid glass. He searches for the geometry he was trained to kill. Hull, turret, tracks. Something solid enough to put crosshairs on. He finds nothing. Just speed. And then the desert answers with a new kind of punctuation. Not the deep concussion of tank fire. Not the familiar arc of artillery. Instead, sharp, sudden hisses, like something slicing the air, followed by a flash that blooms too close, too fast. A tank on the flank erupts in a violent burst of light and smoke. Another vehicle, an armored personnel carrier, jerks, shudders, and goes still as if a switch has been flipped. The radio net fractures into overlapping voices. What was that? Mine? No. Missile. From where? The gunners swing their sights again, hunting the invisible. Soviet doctrine assumes a duel. You see the muzzle flash, you estimate range, you return fire. You trade steel for steel until one side runs out of luck and armor. But there is no other line of tanks here. There is only a swarm. Small shapes darting, weaving, appearing and vanishing in the heat like insects over hot sand. They don't present a neat target. They don't form up for a photograph. They refuse to be the kind of enemy the manuals describe. And then, finally, the sight picture resolves. Pickups, civilian trucks, white sun-baked, bouncing over rock and sand, with a reckless speed that would punish a track suspension. Dozens at first, then the uncomfortable realization that it's many more than dozens. They swerve and split and rejoin, not moving as a column, but as a scattered school of fish. And some of them have something bolted to the bed. A tube as a launcher. A man exposed to the wind and dust, sitting in the open air, where a tank crew would call him suicidal. A thin wire unspools behind a departing projectile, delicate as a thread, cruel as an idea. This is not brute force. This is precision, delivered by motion. A Milan anti-tank missile, French-made, wire-guided, does not need a heavy platform to be lethal. It needs a steady aim for a handful of seconds. The operator watches the missile's tail flare and keeps his crosshair on the target while commands travel down that invisible leash. It is a weapon that rewards nerves, and suddenly the battlefield is full of men with nerves. A missile slams into the side armor of a T-55 at an angle the tank was never meant to accept. A shaped charge focuses energy into a narrow, violent jet that doesn't hit steel so much as insists that steel is negotiable. The tank, designed for a nuclear age, meets a physics trick cheap enough to mount on a truck. From the command post, the view is unreal. Heavy armor, dug in and confident, coming apart in minutes under fire from vehicles that look like they should be delivering groceries. The psychological injury lands first, because to accept what's happening is to accept that the entire story you've been telling yourself about modernity, about doctrine, about Soviet steel as destiny, has a hole in it. And holes in war become doors. The garrison begins to collapse, not as a heroic last stand, but as something more human. Confusion, miscommunication, then flight. Vehicles are abandoned. A fortress becomes an open hand letting go of everything it was meant to hold. Later, when the numbers are read back in offices far from the sand, they sound like propaganda precisely because they are so lopsided, too clean, too humiliating, the kind of report you accuse your enemies of inventing, because the alternative is worse. The alternative is that you lost fairly, and humiliation doesn't stay in one place. It travels. In Tripoli, it becomes a meeting behind closed doors, voices tight, fingers stabbing maps. In Moscow, it becomes a colder kind of question, one asked by men who are trained to treat emotions like a weakness. If this can happen here, what does it mean somewhere that actually matters? Because the T-55 is not just Libyan equipment. It is a Soviet export of an entire worldview. It is proof, in steel, that socialism can outbuild capitalism. That doctrine can outthink improvisation. That modern armies, disciplined armies, will dominate the messy edges of the world. Now there are photographs of Soviet tanks burning in African sand, and someone has to explain why. Investigators arrive to count wrecks and measure impacts. They pace off distances. They look at the marks in the sand and don't find the deep, heavy scars of a mechanized column. They find tire tracks, narrow, chaotic, light. They begin to understand something that doesn't sound like warfare at all. This enemy doesn't bring a logistics tale the way an armored brigade does. There are no huge fuel convoys, no neat supply dumps, no obvious workshops. The trucks are the supply line. The trucks are the workshop. The trucks are the entire operational concept. A jerry can, scratched plastic or dented steel, becomes more valuable than a metal. Because fuel equals motion. Motion equals survival. Survival equals victory. And at the center of it is a kind of physics that feels insulting once you see it. A tank turret has a maximum traverse speed. It is a massive ring of metal driven by motors that must move tons smoothly, precisely, predictably. The gunner's sight has a narrow field of view. The entire system is optimized for targets that move at the pace of other armored vehicles, at ranges where motion across the sight picture is manageable. But if a small vehicle closes the distance, if it turns an engagement into a knife fight, something weird happens. At long range, a fast-moving target crosses your view slowly. At close range, the same target becomes a blur, angular velocity. The truck doesn't need to be invisible. It just needs to move laterally faster than the turret can follow. It needs to live in the tank's blind time, the gap between observation and reaction, the gap between seeing and doing. That's the real weapon at Fada. Not just the missile, tempo. And now Libya's high command reaches for the obvious answer, the one written in bold letters in every air power manual ever printed. If the ground can't catch them, the sky will. Because pickups have no armor, because a single burst can ruin an engine, because a truck, in theory, is the most vulnerable thing on a battlefield, because speed has one predator it cannot outrun: air superiority. Orders go out. Engines spool. Pilots climb into Soviet-made jets and attack aircraft. The plan is simple. Find the dust plumes, find the swarm, and turn it into scrap. For weeks, the desert becomes a hunting ground. And on the ground, Chadian commanders learn a new rule, carved into their nerves by every passing roar overhead. If you stop, you die. If you cluster, you die. So they scatter. They move like liquid, flowing into wadis and behind rocks, hiding under overhangs, smearing mud and scrub onto metal to break up outlines. They refuse to give the sky a clean answer. But they are not just surviving. They are moving forward, toward the heart of Libyan power in northern Chad, toward the fortress that was built to make the desert obey, the air base at Wadi Doom, a hard runway in a soft world, a strategic anchor, a place protected by minefields and layered defenses, built on the assumption that any attacker must slow down, deploy engineers, clear lanes, and accept hours of exposure to guns. Inside the base, defenders repeat that assumption the way you repeat a prayer. Let them come. They'll hit the mines, they'll stall, we'll finish them. And out in the desert, the Chadians do something that looks, at first glance, like madness. They start removing weight from their trucks, doors, panels, anything that isn't a weapon, fuel, or the bare minimum of machine. They check tire pressure. They tighten welded brackets. They turn pickup beds into launch platforms and cargo racks into lifelines. Because they aren't planning to clear the minefield. They aren't planning to go around it. They are planning to do something that will make the men behind the berms believe, just for a moment, that the desert itself has changed the rules of physics. And on the horizon, as the heat wavers and the air base sirens sit quiet in the distance like sleeping animals, a new dust cloud begins to rise, faster than it should, closer than it should, and heading straight for the place that was designed to make speed irrelevant. The sirens at Wadi Doom finally wake up, a hard, rising wail that crawls across the runway and into the bunkers and makes every man inside the base picture the same thing. A slow, doomed enemy stopping at the minefield, hesitating, then dying. On the radar screens, the contacts are small but numerous. On the horizon, the dust looks familiar now, like a signature. The Libyan commander steps outside into the heat and raises his binoculars. He expects to watch a lesson. Instead, he watches a dare. The trucks don't slow down. The pitch of their engines climbs. Thin, furious, unarmored sound. They surge forward as if the minefield is a line on a map, not a physical fact. 60 kilometers an hour. 80, 90. A shout goes up from the observation post that sounds like a man warning someone about a cliff. They're committing suicide. The defenders hold their fire for a heartbeat, because doctrine teaches you to wait for the minefield to do the work. You let the enemy break itself. You conserve ammunition. You keep your line intact. And then, nothing happens. No chain of explosions. No tumbling fireballs. No sudden stillness. The trucks keep moving, bouncing violently over uneven ground, skimming the sand so lightly it looks impossible from a distance. The Libyan commander's mind reaches for explanations it already knows. Perhaps the mines were cleared. Perhaps they're using engineers. Perhaps this is a feint. But he can see it with his own eyes. They're not clearing anything. They're crossing it. This is the first physics slap of the day, and it lands hard. Anti-tank mines are not designed to be clever. They are designed to be reliable. A pressure plate, a firing train, a main charge, a simple promise: put enough weight on me, and I will turn the ground into a weapon. They are built for tanks, 30-40 tons of steel pressing down, long enough for a mechanism to complete its grim little sequence. But a pickup truck, stripped, lightened, almost skeletal, does something different at speed. It doesn't sit on the pressure plate. It taps it. Milliseconds of contact, a blink. And inside many mine fuses, there is a tiny, unavoidable delay. The time it takes a mechanical striker to complete its motion, or a chemical element to finish its reaction, or a spring-loaded system to confirm it isn't being fooled by a passing boot. That delay is small, but at 100 kilometers an hour, small becomes a distance. The detonator triggers behind the truck. The blast erupts behind the truck. The ground tries to kill a target that has already left. In the open desert, this might still cripple a vehicle with shrapnel and shock. It might shred tires, it might wound a driver, but the catastrophic kill, the explosion directly under the center of mass, is being cheated by time, not by armor, by tempo. The Minefield was a math problem designed for heavy machines. The Chadians have introduced a new variable, velocity, and the fortress built on certainty suddenly has a hole. The trucks pour through the breach and into the perimeter like water, finding a crack in a dam. The defenders, trained to fight a slow approach, are suddenly faced with targets moving at highway speed inside their own geometry. T-55 turrets begin to traverse, but now the angles are wrong. The sight picture is too narrow. The targets are too close and too fast. A tank is a king when the board is flat and the pieces move predictably. Inside its own fortress, surrounded, it becomes a castle with its drawbridge stuck halfway up. The first Milan launches from a truck bed at what feels like insulting range. The operator stays exposed, shoulders squared, eyes locked through the sight for those long seconds that matter. The missile rides its wire like a thought made physical. The tank doesn't even have time to understand it is being aimed at. Impact. A shaped charge doesn't need a long speech. It turns steel into a question mark. Smoke and flame punch out of hatches. Crewmen scramble, some out, some not. Another missile follows, then another. The defenders fire back, of course. Heavy machine guns chew sand into fountains. Autocannon rounds crack past truck beds. An RPG arcs, misses, detonates against a berm. One pickup flips, rolls, becomes a brief, ugly punctuation mark. But the swarm doesn't care about individual losses. That's what makes it a swarm. It disperses around danger, then recombines behind you. And within minutes, the base's layers stop behaving like layers. The minefields are now irrelevant because the fight is inside them. The fixed guns are looking the wrong direction. The air defense crews, trained to track aircraft, are watching ground targets flash past too quickly to bracket. The logic of a fortress assumes the enemy must arrive at the gate. The Chadians have arrived everywhere at once. A group of trucks breaks away from the chaos and sprints toward the runway. The tarmac shimmers. Heat makes the aircraft look like mirages. And there, lined up in neat rows as if waiting for a parade, are the crown jewels of the Libyan presence. Jets, helicopters, trainers, machines that represent a different kind of prestige, a different kind of modern. On paper, they are terrifying. On the ground, with engines cold and crews panicking, they are fragile. A jet needs time. Time to spool, to taxi, to accelerate, to lift. Time is exactly what the swarm denies. A pickup pulls alongside an aircraft that is trying to move, its pilot trapped in the cockpit by procedure and fear. For a second, the mismatch is so absurd it almost feels like comedy. A cheap commercial truck next to a supersonic strike platform. Then the gunner in the truck bed raises an RPG. The explosion is not cinematic. It is practical. A violent bloom, a tear in metal, a sudden fire fed by aviation fuel. Another aircraft catches, another burns. The airfield becomes a row of expensive objects learning what they are without their context. In a control tower, a Soviet advisor, one of the quiet men whose job is to make proxies look competent, stares at the runway through glass that suddenly feels thin. He has spent his career thinking in columns and echelons and ranges. He has lived inside doctrine. Now, doctrine is a liability you can smell. The advisor reaches for what matters to him. Documents, codebooks, encryption keys. Not medals, not pride, information. Because if the base falls intact, the loss won't just be counted in tanks and aircraft. It will be counted in secrets. And when the fighting finally tilts into collapse, it doesn't collapse like a heroic last stand. It collapses like a system that has lost its rhythm. Men run, vehicles are abandoned. Defensive belts become obstacles for the defenders as much as for the attackers. In less than a morning, the fortress of strategic dominance becomes a stripped carcass of equipment, smoke, and stunned survivors. The Chadians are suddenly inside a world they were never meant to own. Warehouses of ammunition, fuel stores, radar systems, crates stamped with Cyrillic letters, surface-to-air missiles sitting in the sand like captured sea monsters. And in the middle of it all, parked, intact enough to matter, an export model Mi-25 attack helicopter. To someone outside the Cold War, it's just a helicopter. To the Cold War itself, it is a locked room that has just been left open. The Mi-24 family, famous, feared, mythologized, had spent the decade proving a point over Afghanistan. The West had seen it from far away. Grainy satellite photos, gun camera glimpses, intelligent summaries full of cautious verbs. But seen is not the same as touched. Touched means you can measure, you can photograph internals, you can pull panels, you can learn frequencies, you can understand how the jammers behave, you can figure out what it looks like on radar when it's trying to hide. You can teach your missiles what to ignore and what to love. A machine like this is not just hardware, it is a library. And it is now sitting under a brutal sun, guarded by men who arrived in pickup trucks. That's when the war changes shape. In N'Djamena, there is celebration, gunfire into the air, looting for food, water, spare parts, anything useful. For Chadian soldiers, victory tastes like survival. It tastes like finally flipping the table on an occupier with more money and more metal. But in Paris and Washington, the celebration is colder, a different kind of hunger. Because now, the question isn't how did they win? It's what did they capture? In Tripoli, panic begins to leak through the cracks of denial. Libya can accept losing men. Regimes always accept losing men. They can even accept losing tanks, because tanks can be replaced with money and shipments and paperwork. But losing prestige, losing secrets, losing a symbol of Soviet engineering to the other side's engineers, that is not a battlefield defeat. That is a geopolitical hemorrhage. Somewhere in the chain of command, a decision hardens into an order. Destroy the evidence. Not because it's tactically necessary, but because humiliation, if it becomes intelligence, becomes permanent. And so, the sky darkens again. Not with the nimble jets hunting dust plumes, but with heavier aircraft tasked with a simpler mission. Turn the captured airbase into a crater. Erase the runway. Erase the hangars. Erase the wreckage. Bury the helicopter under rubble and fire. From far away, the sound arrives first. A low rumble that does not belong to the desert. The Chadians hear it and understand something that every soldier learns eventually. You can win the ground and still be helpless under the sky. They have captured surface-to-air systems they barely know how to operate. They have missiles they can't code. They have radars they can't authenticate. They have a treasure they can't move quickly. But they still have one advantage left. The same advantage that brought them here. Motion. Instead of digging in and becoming fixed targets, they do the only thing that has kept them alive since Fada. They mobilize. Trucks roar across the perimeter, kicking up dust that now feels like a shield. Captured anti-aircraft guns, quad-mounted heavy machine guns, crude but angry, are loaded into beds. Crews improvise mounts and sights. They drive out into the surrounding desert and build a defense not as a wall, but as a shifting, moving perimeter. A mobile air defense screen. It isn't elegant. It's a refusal. When the bombers appear, they do not find a neat base to obliterate. They find a mess, a web of tracer fire rising from dunes, bursts of lead from unexpected angles, unpredictable movement, targets that don't stay where the map says they should be. Bombers are kings when the battlefield is static. Against chaos, they become cautious. They climb higher. They bomb from safer altitudes. Accuracy suffers. Explosions walk across empty sand. They hit wrecked hangars that were already wrecked. They carve craters into places that mattered an hour ago. And the helicopter, the real prize, survives, stubbornly, like a secret the desert refuses to give back. Then another clock begins. Not the clock of bomb fuses or turret traverse speeds. The clock of intelligence. Because the moment the West hears that a Mi-25 has been captured intact enough to study, the idea stops being theoretical and becomes operational. Men who normally live in offices begin packing equipment, not because they love risk, but because opportunity like this doesn't stay on the ground for long. The air over Wadi Doom is thick with heat and smoke and the sour smell of burned fuel. The runway is scarred. The hangars are open wounds. The desert hums with engines coming and going, like a nervous system refusing to settle. And somewhere inside the chaos, the Mi-25 sits like a trapped animal, high-tech, heavy, and suddenly very mortal. The Chadians can guard it. They can hide parts. They can move pieces in trucks, playing a shell game with the sky. But they cannot pretend this will last forever. Because across the border, in Libya, men are staring at the same maps with different emotions now. Not arrogance, not boredom, a sharp personal anger. They have been embarrassed by pickups. Now they want a spectacle of revenge. And the next wave gathering in the north isn't coming to win a battle. It's coming to erase a memory. The rumble in the distance grows steadier, closer, and then a new sound threads through it, higher, sharper, like a scream that doesn't belong to machines on the ground. Rotors. Not Libyan, not Soviet, something else. Something arriving low, fast, and very carefully. Because if this helicopter is the library, someone is about to try to check it out, while the people who own the building are setting it on fire. The rotors come in low, and the desert seems to flinch. Not because it's never heard helicopters, this war has been full of them, but because these blades carry a different kind of intention. They don't circle like predators. They don't strafe. They don't announce themselves with arrogance. They arrive like thieves. A transport aircraft touches down on the battered runway with a violence that feels improvised. Tires scream. Dust explodes outward. For a moment, the base that was supposed to be erased becomes an active airfield again. Alive with men moving quickly, quietly, and with the kind of urgency that doesn't come from bravery. It comes from timing. On the tarmac, the Mi-25 sits in the heat like a prize that doesn't know it's a prize. Its windows are dark. Its skin is scarred. Up close, the machine feels heavier than any story about it. Armored glass, thick panels, hard angles designed to survive things that would shred other aircraft. And now it is helpless on the ground, surrounded by a war that has no patience for helpless things. A small team of technicians jogs toward it with tool cases clattering, heads down, eyes scanning the sky. Their movements are not cinematic. They are methodical. They kneel, pop access panels, and begin the work that turns legend into inventory. Bolts, pins, wiring looms. Hands on cold metal that was built behind the Iron Curtain. The air is brutal, hot enough to make breathing feel like swallowing sand. The smell is worse. Burned fuel, cordite, and the sour edge of bodies left too long in the sun. The technicians don't linger on any of it. They don't have the luxury. Somewhere beyond the runway, engines are still running, pickup engines, a constant restless growl. Chadian trucks weave around the base like nervous cells in a living organism. Drivers bring fuel, bring water, bring ammunition, bring captured parts and haul away other parts. A jerry can is passed hand to hand like a sacred object, because fuel is time, and time is what everyone is spending now. In the distance, the sky shifts again. A low rumble, steady as a threat. Libyan bombers, higher now, cautious, angry, make their passes. The first wave misses the runway by hundreds of meters, turning open desert into new craters. The second wave walks closer. Concrete shudders. Shrapnel rattles against the skin of the parked wrecks. The technicians don't look up. They can't. Looking up is a form of prayer, and prayer is not a plan. They work faster. The plan isn't to fly the Mi-25 out. That would require training, time, and airspace control, none of which exist here. The plan is smaller and more ruthless. Take what matters, strip the brain, steal the nervous system. Avionics, radios, countermeasure components, anything with circuitry, anything with numbers. The helicopter is a library, and they are ripping pages out before the building burns. The Chadians understand this instinctively, even if they don't speak the language of signals intelligence or electronic warfare. They know what value looks like, because value has been the difference between life and death since the first dust cloud at Fada. So, they do what they always do. They move. When bombs fall close, the parts vanish into trucks. When jets sweep low, The trucks scatter into wadis and behind rock, hiding in the geography like animals that have learned the shape of danger. When the sky clears for minutes, the trucks return and the work continues. A shell game played with engines and courage. Somewhere in this, you can feel the Cold War's absurdity tightening like a knot. A high-tech Soviet attack helicopter, designed to dominate battlefields, is being protected by pickup trucks and men who can carry half its critical components in their hands. This is the war's cruel joke. The super tank age meets the super cheap age, and the cheap side is learning how to protect a secret better than the expensive side can destroy it. In Tripoli, men rage at maps. In Moscow, men who do not like surprises begin to understand that the embarrassment is no longer local, it is contagious. It can travel across oceans in crates and photographs. It can become doctrine in the hands of the enemy. They wanted Libya to be a billboard of Soviet superiority. Now, it's an advertisement for a flaw, and that flaw has a name that doesn't sound like strategy. It sounds like a car dealership. Toyota. What happened at Fada and Wadi Doom is not a miracle, no matter how it looked from the periscope slit. It's something far more dangerous to the old order. It's a system hack. A tank is a masterpiece of protection and firepower, but it is also a commitment. It commits you to roads, to fuel, to maintenance, to crew training, to recovery vehicles, to supply lines that can be seen from the sky and predicted on a map. A pickup truck commits you to almost nothing. It commits you to motion. It can be fixed with a wrench and a hammer. It can drink dirty fuel. It can carry a missile today and sacks of grain tomorrow. It can disappear into the desert as easily as it appears. It doesn't need a parade. It doesn't need permission. Most importantly, it doesn't need to fight you where you want to fight. The Libyans kept trying to force the war back into a shape they recognized. Lines, belts, strong points, Overwatch. The Chadians refused. They turned the battlefield into a question of angles, timing, and decision speed, of how fast you could see, decide, act, and leave. And the heavy machine, built to survive a nuclear battlefield, discovered a smaller vulnerability. It couldn't rotate its reality fast enough. That vulnerability shows up in the smallest place, in a tank turret. A gunner's sight is a tunnel, a narrow slice of the world. At long range, it feels powerful. At close range, it becomes a trap. When the enemy moves laterally at high speed, the target doesn't just move, it vanishes. The turret whines, the motors strain, the crosshair lags behind the world. And for the crew inside, the war becomes something they were never trained for. A blur they can't catch. A periscope slit full of dust. A drinking straw aimed at a swarm. That's the humiliation at the core of this story. Not that tanks were bad, but that they were confident in the wrong geometry. The days after Wadi Doom are not clean. They are a mess of raids, retreats, and the slow realization, on the Libyan side, that the desert has stopped behaving like a place where mass and money automatically win. On the Chadian side, victory doesn't erase hardship. A pickup truck is still unarmored. A missile operator still has to sit exposed for seconds that feel like years. Speed still demands fuel, and fuel still demands supply. The jerry can never stops being the real crown jewel. But something has changed, not just in Chad, in the minds of people watching. Because while Chad is fighting for territory, the world's major powers are watching for a different reason. The lessons. They see an economy of war being inverted. A missile that costs a fraction of a tank can destroy it with surgical certainty if it can get into position. A vehicle that costs a tiny fraction of an armored platform can deliver that missile and still be useful afterward. A force that cannot afford to lose dozens of tanks can afford to lose trucks, and often doesn't have to. And suddenly, superiority starts to look less like armor thickness and more like cost exchange rates. How much do you spend to force the enemy to spend? How much do you risk to force the enemy to risk more? How quickly can you decide? How quickly can you move? That's the truth that makes men in polished offices uneasy, because it suggests that power can be stolen with a hardware store mindset. Now, here's the final twist that completes the irony. Even after the first frantic stripping of components, even after the shell game with trucks and wadis, the helicopter itself still exists as a problem. Too heavy to hide, too valuable to abandon, too dangerous to keep sitting under a sky full of enemies. And this is where the story steps out of the desert and into the shadow world. Months later, after the immediate crisis has passed, after the first waves of rage and denial and cleanup, another helicopter arrives in Chad under a different kind of secrecy. Not a Soviet gunship, not a Libyan bomber. A heavy-lift machine brought by the United States in a covert operation that will later be known as Mount Hope III. The absurdity of it is almost perfect. The Cold War's legendary flying tank, the symbol of Soviet reach, is lifted like cargo, slung underneath a Western helicopter, and carried away as an object to be studied, disassembled, understood. The Iron Curtain reduced to a load on a hook, and somewhere in that image, if you let yourself look at it long enough, you can see the whole era in miniature. Proxies fighting in the sand while the Giants harvest outcomes. Not land, information. Because in the end, the Mi-25 isn't the point. The point is what its capture represents. A small war becoming a laboratory where the old rules are tested, and a great power, through its proxy, fails. The desert begins to cool at night. The heat finally loosens its grip. The hulks of burned tanks sit like dark islands on pale sand. Metal ticks as it contracts. Smoke thins into the sky until it becomes the same thin haze that fooled optics at noon. A Libyan tank gunner, if he survives, will remember the sound of the turret motor straining, the way the crosshair couldn't keep up, the moment he realized his armor was not a shield against something he couldn't track. A Chadian driver, if he survives, will remember his hands on the wheel, knuckles white with grit, the engine screaming as the minefield rushed under him, the shock of explosions behind instead of beneath, the feeling that speed was the only religion that worked out here. And far away, in rooms where people argue about budgets and doctrines and futures, someone will circle a line on a paper and not quite know why their stomach tightens. Because the Toyota War leaves behind a question that isn't about Chad, it's about everyone. If a pickup truck can kill a tank, if speed can turn minefields into suggestions, if decentralized motion can make a fortress irrelevant, then what else, in all your expensive certainty, is built on an assumption the enemy will refuse to honor? The Cold War liked clear categories: modern and backward, armored and unarmored, superpower and proxy. The Sahara didn't care. It offered a simpler, uglier lesson. Superiority is not just what you own. It's what you can make the battlefield become. And on that day in 1987, under a white-hot sun, the battlefield became dust, angles, and time, moving faster than steel could turn. In the end, the periscope slit shows nothing but heat shimmer. The enemy isn't in front. He never was. He's already gone, engine fading into the dunes, leaving behind cooling wreckage and one last haunting thought. In a world obsessed with bigger guns, sometimes the deadliest weapon is the gap between seeing and reacting, and sometimes the thing that wins the war is parked in a driveway.